Welcome. And it's really wonderful to see so many people here tonight. Some people I know a little bit and have worked with and over the years. So it feels like being with some old friends. And I'm really happy to talk tonight about a little bit about mindfulness, about lots of other things too, but a little bit about mindfulness. And if you're anything like me, you're probably a little bit tired about hearing about mindfulness everywhere. And that surge of interest that happens in the new year when we want to maybe change our lives a little bit, or we want to kind of come home to ourselves, be a little bit more at peace with ourselves. And mindfulness is, it's one way of doing that. One of many ways, I think. A new year and a new you. I think the important piece there is the question mark after the new you. And the question mark after how mindfulness might help. So we'll have some time towards the end of what I'm going to say for some questions and some kind of dialogue. I think that would be really helpful. I don't live too far from here, and I was cycling down Thomas Street this day last week, and I was stopped kind of near here, near Vickers Street, and at the stop of the lights and on my bike, and there were two elderly ladies. They were dealing, street dealers, and so I was stopped and just within kind of hearing distance of them. And as I was there, this woman walked by, and she was very ambitiously dressed, and the two dealers are there and they're chatting to each other, and one of them is like pulling on a cigarette, and she says to the other one, she says, "Would you look at her?" She said, "She loves herself." The state of her. So she loves herself. So I smiled. I thought, isn't that interesting? And I thought about those interactions that we have on a daily basis that are punctuated with advice on how to be with ourselves, on how to treat ourselves. So, and I've been listening in the last week, and very often the last thing we say when we leave someone that we love, or we say goodbye, we say, "Good luck now, take care of yourself." Right? It's a very common thing that we say. So mind yourself now, won't you? See you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Mind yourself. Right? So our interactions, our partings are often about recognizing the self in someone else. Mind yourself. Take good care of yourself. This idea of self, like your woman who loved herself. My younger sister and her husband, their baby died very tragically 3 years ago. And I remember about 6 months after that, my sister said to me, my baby sister, she said to me, she said, "People keep telling me to mind myself. Every time I see someone that I haven't met since Aoife died, people say mind myself." She said, "I don't know what it means. What does it mean to mind ourselves?" She says, "What does it mean to mind myself? I don't know." I was thinking as well today about, after this time of year and the resolution that maybe a lot of us made a couple of weeks ago, that we weren't going to eat any more chocolate, or we weren't going to smoke, or we weren't going to drink red wine until February. Am I on my own? No. Okay. Thanks very much. That's very reassuring. And then what happens, when we break that? We break that resolution. You'll hear friends, you'll say to yourself, friends in work will say to you, I'm so annoyed with myself for doing that, right? I'm so annoyed with myself. Or other situations, when we don't get the job that we want, when we get something really wrong at an interview, when we say something that we know is hurtful, but it's come out before we could stop ourselves, when we hurt someone that we love inadvertently, when we get it wrong, we often say things to ourselves like, I need to give myself a good kick up the arse. Do you know that one? Yeah. So we say these things to ourselves. We talk to ourselves. We say things about our relationship that we have with ourselves. We're different from a lot of other species on this planet. We also, the way we're probably pretty good at noticing how other people are with themselves. So you might say about your son or your daughter or someone that you love, God, she's so hard on herself. If only she could give herself a break. We hear ourselves say that, and we're very familiar with words and concepts like self-esteem, self-hatred, self-promotion, self-respect, self-indulgence. And you've spotted the common denominator here. It's self. The one with self-esteem, and there's a lovely paper published recently, and it said, psychologists are falling out of love with self-esteem. We might have gotten it wrong. And very often when we see people suffer, people that we love, when we see them suffer, we see young people suffer, we think, oh, it's down to very poor self-esteem. And we're kind of not too sure about that anymore, actually. It may not be about self-esteem. The problem with self-esteem is, right, that it always means someone has to be worse than me, right? It always means I have to be at least halfway, hit the halfway mark in the class. Does that make sense? So someone always needs, because it's comparative. So self-esteem is generally about how do I compare to other people. So it's not a very, it's probably not a very healthy model or way for us to organise society. And I don't think it's a very healthy way for us to organise or to aid our children's development. That I'm okay once I'm a little bit better than someone else. Does that make a little bit of sense? So the idea that we're beginning to kind of question self-esteem, but these phrases and these understandings that we have about self-esteem and self-promotion and self-regard and self-interest, all these ones we hear all the time, are very common to us. And it's my understanding that the language that we use, right, from the dealers on the street, she loves herself, right, to our comment about someone who's self-promoting, or the comment to ourselves that says, I'm so annoyed with myself, that language reveals a lot, right? So the words we use are really important. They really do say a lot about us psychologically. They say a lot about what's going on in our mind. They reveal a lot. They reveal a lot about the inner workings of our minds. These phrases, they point to something that psychologists have recently begun to study. So these phrases, the scientists, the social scientists and the psychologists are calling what we've just talked about self-to-self relating. So if you go home and Google self-to-self relating, you'll find lots of studies now where people are beginning to look and to study this interaction we have with ourselves. Does that make a little bit of sense? That we actually are beginning to realize that we have a relationship with ourselves. Now, when I say that to some people, they look at me like I have 6 heads. They're like, what are you talking about? I have a relationship with myself. Let's see about that. So, like the women I described to you on Thomas Street, these everyday words and language and descriptions and ways that we talk about ourselves underlie or illustrate an underlying psychological process. This language, these phrases reveal often an unconscious relationship that we have with ourselves, or theoretically speaking, that self-to-self relationship. So just think for a moment or two about a friend that you have. Think about someone that you're kind of go-to. So when things go wrong, when you're in need of a conversation or you need to run something by someone, think about the person you go to. Maybe just bring them to mind and think, it's probably X. And there might be different people you might bring different problems to, but just someone you're close to. So think about them. And if you could, can you describe that relationship you have with them in a couple of words? We know from all of the research over the years that the most protective thing for us emotionally, psychologically, are our social support. Because we generally feel better when we're connected. Yeah? And we generally don't do so well when we're isolated and alone. And that might be maybe a moment of longer eye contact and an acknowledgement of the bus driver, you know? And those friendships that I talked about, the tone of that friendship, being non-judgmental, being supportive, being respectful, being honest, being intelligent, being non-critical, right? How would you describe the relationship that you have with yourself? If you could maybe even think of a couple of words for yourself that might capture the relationship that you have with yourself. Judgmental. Critical. And isn't it interesting, you know, that relationship we have with ourselves, that's critical, that's not compassionate, that's unkind, that's frustrated, that's intolerant. That is the one relationship in our lives that we can't escape. Just for us to note the different tone, the different atmosphere of the relationship that we have with ourselves. And it's probably, I think we might be able to summarize it in a couple of those words that about criticism, highly critical, huge expectations, and tending to be very unforgiving, and having very high standards for ourselves, hugely high standards for ourselves. And as I say, the challenge is a lot of the other relationships in our lives we can walk away from. Sometimes not too easily, but we can walk away from. But the relationship with ourselves that's the one we can't. And that's the one that drives us insane. That relationship we have with ourselves. We know that from the research, without getting into all of that research and boring everyone in the audience, we know from the research that those of us who suffer from depression or have suffered from depression, are much more critical of ourselves. So all of these studies that looked at hundreds and thousands of people in different parts of the world, what they identify and what they find is that people, those of us who've suffered from depression, are much, much, much more critical of ourselves. Almost a universal finding. That we have relationships with ourselves that are highly critical, are harsh in nature, and we tend to be much less forgiving and much less kind on ourselves. The reasons for that, well, who knows? But when we get depressed, we tend to swing between I'm useless self-talk, right? This kind of talk that says, I'm absolutely useless. I'm hopeless, I'm worthless, I'm never going to be any good, it's never going to change, right? We tend to swing between that and a sense of, or a self-talk that says, well, nobody really appreciates me, nobody really understands me, and I'm very unappreciated or loved in the world. So we can swing between both of those. Does that make a little bit of sense to people? That kind of self-talk, we can swing between both of those. And the real tragedy is that there's really very little kindness or very little tenderness in between those two extremes. those two extremes, are really absent in kindness and in tenderness. The research in the field has shown that much of the self-talk, right, so much of the stuff that we're talking about right now is unconscious, right, that it goes on at a level that we're not really tuned into. And Freud, good old Freud, described the mind as being like an iceberg, right, and that we really only know the top little bit of it, kind of like less than that actually, about 30% of it is known to us, right? And then the rest of it is kind of below the surface, and we don't really know what's going on there. But Freud also said that what's underneath the water, what we don't see, is often the most powerful. So what I'm talking about is the unconscious mind, right? The stuff that we don't always have access to. Does that make a little bit of sense? And what happens is it's often in there that there's a lot of self-talk, a lot of high criticism going on in there, in the unconscious mind. And at times, for many of us, that bubbles to the surface too, and we begin to hear it very loud. But the idea is, or the understanding is, that underneath the surface, is a rumbling commentary that's saying something like, you're not good enough, you're useless, why didn't you do better? What did I miss in my life? Why didn't they notice me, right? There's that rumbling conversation. And it's strong, and underneath the surface is where most of that self-talk is generated. It's here that our minds are busy trying to make sense of the world, actively interpreting our every experience, actively engaged in interpretation from the moment we open our eyes. So this is where a lot of the self that I've been talking about kind of happens. From the moment we open our eyes in the morning, interpretation, right? From the moment we open our eyes, we make an immediate interpretation. What might it be at this time of the year? It's freezing. Right? So right away, we open our eyes and we begin to think, where's the duvet? You know? Right? So we begin to make interpretations all the time. And very quickly you might think, or you might even so a lot of this is going on in the unconscious mind. You might hear the rain outside the window and begin somewhere in your head to go, oh, Jesus, and the bus, and it's going to be really busy, and then I won't be able to park and work, blah, 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 right? So a lot of this interpretation is going on in our minds all the time from the moment we open our eyes. Mark Williams, a psychologist who worked in Oxford for many years, he described this, or a function of this, as the discrepancy monitor. So what does he mean by that? Right? Mark says that what goes on in our brains, and a lot of it unconsciously, is a discrepancy monitor. Right? So we're looking out for what doesn't match up with my expectations. So it's colder than I want it to be. It's hotter than I want it to be. It's earlier than I want it to be. So our discrepancy monitor is on. And that's basically very often saying, this isn't how I want it to be right now. Does that make a bit of sense? Yeah. And that, my friends, is probably what happens first thing in the morning for most of us. This is not how I want it to be. That there's a discrepancy between my world right now and how I want it to be. The easiest, and again, I think it was Mark Williams, a very fine psychologist, who said that the easiest way to relax is to stop wanting things to be different from how they are now. So the easiest way to relax is to stop wanting things to be different from how they are now. So, and I say now, the end word is really important, and on that now, not forever, but just for now. When we start to think about acceptance, we can kind of think, well, what does that mean? I just turn over and lie down and don't seek to change my life. No, not at all. But the first step is the allowing. I often say I work mainly with cancer patients and patients at end of life in the hospital. And I almost always say to people that, acceptance is a big ask, right? So asking ourselves to accept something is a big ask. I've never got there. But if we can ask ourselves to allow it, does that make a little bit of sense? So if any of you have had kids, teenage kids, right? Sometimes it's not a good idea to accept their behavior, because it can be harmful, right? But there are times when you've got to allow it. Does that make a little bit of sense? You don't want it. It's not good, but this is how it is. So it's a very, very similar words, but there's a different feel to it. So if we can work on allowing what is right now as the springboard to change, that's really important. Someone kind of facetiously in a debate thing that was going on a while ago I was involved with asked me what did I think was the greatest cause of human unhappiness. And I said, I think it's the always-on discrepancy monitor. That part of our brain that is looking at things and saying, it's different to how I want it to be and I don't like it. That resistance to how things are right now. I understand, theoretically, experientially, and much more importantly, personally, from my own life as a human being, that discrepancy monitor, that resisting things as they are right now, has been for me the greatest cause of my own emotional and psychological suffering. So just to go back a little bit to the idea of self-talk, right? So we have this self and we talk to this self and we say things to this self, and they're generally not very nice. The critical point here is that the quality, if you like, the tone and the amount of kindness in that self-talk, that relating to ourselves, is crucial to our emotional well-being, to our psychological health, and importantly, to the well-being of people around us. So there's a direct correlation, I hypothesize or suspect, between the tone, right, the warmth of how we are with ourselves and our happiness. Does that make a little bit of sense? So the warmer, the kinder we are with ourselves, the happier we're going to be. But importantly, that also has implications for the other people in our lives and the wider community. Because the kinder I am to myself, the more tolerant I am to myself, that has impact, huge impact, on the people that I live with, the people I work with, the people that I love. So it has impact beyond me. And it's something of to bear in mind when we think about the tendency, perhaps in modern culture, for us to become very isolated, or to see changes for oneself, merely in terms of self-improvement for me as an isolated identity. But I'm not. I exist in the world. I have impact in the world. And the degree to which I'm kind to myself has huge implications for how the world is with itself. The human mind has enormous capacity. It has enormous capacity for integration, for connection, for wellness, and equally an enormous capacity to keep us on a treadmill of self-hatred, of self-inflation, of self-obsession. The treadmill of selfing, right? That it becomes a treadmill where we are going nowhere very quickly. but we're getting very tired, very isolated, and very lonely. So that treadmill of selfing, where we are utterly focused on the self. And the important thing to say there is that may be a focus on oneself with self-hatred or inflation or obsession. Does that make a bit of sense? So it can be either. It can be, I hate myself, this is awful, or aren't I absolutely wonderful? It can be either of those extremes, but those extremes cause us to do a lot of selfing and get onto that treadmill. Most of the things that define us, so most of the things that that define this self, we actually had nothing to do with. So even our names that we cherish, where we were born, our family, many of our physical characteristics, our hair and eye colour, we had absolutely no choice over them whatsoever. None at all. And yet, they're often things that we hold on very tightly to when we think about ourselves. We didn't choose where we were born. We didn't choose our genetic makeup. We didn't choose our emotional state. We didn't choose our basic temperament. We didn't choose our body and how it works. We didn't choose our basic human desires and needs. And we didn't choose the time in history we were born. The problem is when we do a lot of selfing, we begin to think we're responsible for all of those things, when in fact we're not responsible for any of them. Have you ever noticed that when we are at times of stress or times of fear, times of uncertainty, our world, our emotional, psychological world tends to shrink, right? It tends to get very small. It tends to get very narrow. And we tend to kind of live, or some would say that we exist more and more in a bubble of subjective self, right? So the more anxious, afraid, uncertain, worried, or stressed we are, the more we tend to retreat into a little bubble that's about ourselves. This can be experienced as a very fused, a very tightly held kind of narrative about ourselves, a very fixed kind of story about myself. So the more stressed we become, the more clear we become. I often say to patients is that, you know the times when you're absolutely certain about something? No? It's probably the time you're most likely to be wrong. You know that when we get I know for definite what she said. I know why she did it, right? So when we absolutely know something for certain, it's then we've got to question ourselves quite thoroughly. Because it's generally what happens when we're in a very defensive, self-defending, protective mode, and we get very narrow. Someone described a story of being in some part, maybe in Canada, I can't remember, of being in a cabin somewhere, I kind of isolated, and they were there and having dinner and stuff, and then suddenly they heard this kind of very loud noise outside, and they looked up and there's like a big huge bear at the window, right? Now that time, my friends, is not the time to start worrying about yourself emotionally, right? That's the time, right, when we need to get very narrow, right? We need to go, action, right? So our perspective, when we're in danger, our perspective narrows. That's how we all got here tonight. That's how I managed to get here on a bicycle, because it's dangerous out there, right? So we narrow down our perspective. It's great. The problem is when we do a lot of self-talking, when we do a lot of selfing, the same thing begins to happen, and we get very narrow. Does that make a little bit of sense? So, a very important function of brain, but one that we can overuse. So, this model of mind and our ability to kind of perspective take, to be flexible, to consider and rethink, is often very restricted. under times of stress and at times of a lot of selfing. But it's really important to say that we have some hardware in here that isn't very good. It's tricky. It's not great. And the really important thing to say is that you or I did not design the brains that we inherited. If we did, we probably would have done a better job. Our brains are tricky. And a little bit like our DNA, a little bit like our name, where we were born, we didn't choose these brains. And these brains can cause us a lot of emotional difficulty. And that is not your fault. That's not your fault. I am no neuropsychologist, so I don't know an awful lot about brains. I know a little bit about brains. And this is how I think about it very simply. We have an old brain right in the middle, and people describe it like, it's like, see my thumb there, and my thumb in the middle, that the thumb is like the oldest part of the brain, right? Ancient, ancient, ancient. And then we got very clever over the centuries, and we developed this outer brain. It's kind of stuff that's here, right? And that's the stuff, that's the part of my brain that allows me plan. So we had a gorgeous Cocker Spaniel called Charlie. And Charlie didn't have a lot going on here, right? Because he didn't really need it. And he didn't need to plan a lot, right? We do. And as a result, we have all of this wonderful apparatus in our heads going on that allow us to plan for the future. They allow us to think, my car is down at the car park and I don't have any change. Or we're going to go on holiday in May. Or we're going, right? They allow us to plan lots of lovely things, right? But what's the downside? They also allow us to think of worst case scenario, right? That we create and plan or fill in worst case scenario. Did anyone's mother ever say to them, better safe than sorry? Right? So, because that's what our brains do. Our brains can, over the years, think the worst. So we're better safe than sorry. It's going to be awful. Something terrible is going to go wrong, right? So we think about the worst and we prepare for it. So we have the old brain and we have the new brain. And they haven't, if there's kind of IT people who know things about, lots of things I don't know about, but how you integrate systems, right? Our brains haven't integrated fully. So we have the old brain, its concern is our survival. So the old brain is, you're standing at the road, at the traffic lights, and there's a kid beside you, and the kid walks out, and there's a car coming. Kicks into action, grabs the kid. Wonderful, right? That's why we're here. We're here, the alarm goes off, we leave, right? So we respond, right? And all that's happening in the old brain. But then we have this other brain that is analytic, that does the thinking, that does the rational thinking, that does the planning, the worrying, the rumination, the imagination, the self-awareness, and the identity. So a little bit like the pig we saw, it gives us the capacity to think about ourselves. So we have two systems that aren't very well integrated, and that's not your fault. This is an evolutionary process, because we're evolving as a species, and so are our brains. But they cause us problems. They get a bit tricky. So we get caught. For people in the audience who are anxious, for example, right, who suffer from anxiety, what happens is our worrying, our ruminating, our imagination kicks into overdrive, right? So the primitive brain is going, there could be a danger here, right? So Charlie, the Cocker Spaniel, would do a legger, right? We add another layer to it and go, well, how do I prevent this? What will I do? What will make it worse? What can I do? Right? So we think about scenarios, and that's wonderful, but they don't quite mix. So unfortunately, we're the victims of an evolutionary process, and that's not our fault. But the problem is we're inclined to internalize that and think that I'm doing something wrong. There's something wrong with me. Yeah. There's a story told, and I believe it's true, of... I think it's a little bit related to what happens when we end up selfing, when we end up doing a lot of that self-critical talk, We end up being very concerned about ourselves all the time. That we can end up living very, very restricted, very narrow lives that, despite the opportunities that may present themselves, we can end up living in very narrow pastures, or very narrow patterns. There's a story told about this tiger the tiger's called Mahoney. I think I'm pronouncing that properly. And the tiger lived for many years in Washington, in D.C., in their zoo in Washington, D.C. And for most of the years of her life there in the zoo, she lived in, the kind of old, people remember it from Dublin Zoo, the old kind of line houses. I mean, they were kind of concrete and barbed wire, and they might have kind of thrown in half a tree at some point. Mahoney lived all of her life in an old line house like that in the zoo in Washington, D.C. And then they thought, this isn't fair. This isn't a great way to keep animals, and people were protesting. And so the biologists and the zookeepers got some money, and they built this beautiful, spacious enclosure. And there were trees and hills and ponds, the whole lot. You can get the picture, and they were delighted. So there was great excitement the day that they were going to let Mahoney out into her new world. And so they all were there, and there was camera crews, and there was all excitement, and they came out, and Mahoney was there. And what did she do? She walked to the very same place that her little line house had been, her 12 by 12 patch, and apparently lived the rest of her life there, because she was so familiar with the restriction, with the limitation, that it was almost too late, despite the opportunity for excitement and newness and spaciousness. It was almost too late. The really good news is, as human beings, is that it's never too late for us. That our brains, our hearts and our minds have incredible capacity to reorganize themselves, to reorganize how they are in the world, to experience the joy of newness and spaciousness, to move away from narrowness. It's a very interesting study done, I think, with taxi drivers in London. And so, the idea was, years ago, that our brains were formed, right? And then that's how they stayed for the rest of our lives. They were like kind of concrete. That was it. Didn't change. And in fact, when I started to study psychology, that's what we kind of understood happened. And then they began to think, actually, that's not true. So kind of through imaging, taking photographs of brains, they begin to realize, oh, actually, the brain does change. And they came up with this idea that the brain is much more kind of plastic. Kind of plastic that if you kind of heat it, it'll kind of melt a little bit. They began to go, oh, actually, that's what the brain is more like, right? That it can change and reform. So they did this study with these guys in London, black taxi cab drivers in London. So all these guys were, fairly the same. They kind of left school around the same age, and they were driving taxis in this huge city. So they compared them to a group of guys who had the same level of education, came from the same neck of the woods. They compared them, and they put them into an MRI scanner, and they looked at their brains. And they realised that the taxi drivers, who hadn't begun to learn their way around London, you know what that's like, they hadn't begun to do that until they were at least 18 years of age. So the brain was you would think, well-formed at that point. So what they realised when they looked at their brains was the guys who had learned to drive a taxi, that a certain part of the brain was almost twice the size compared to the guys who weren't driving taxis. So their learning to drive taxis and their learning to find their way around the city changed the shape of their brains. Does that make a little bit of sense? Now, the very same mechanism, the very same thing can happen to us when we want to change how we are with ourselves, when we want to change the relationship that we have with ourselves. So it's really important to say that The plus side of the evolutionary process that we're involved in means that our brains are malleable, that they're a little bit plastic. And so are our hearts. So it's not fixed, and it can change. So Mahoney, the poor pet, lived out her life in the corner of the zoo, pacing 12 by 12, because that's what she knew. And in some ways, we can do the same thing. We can be imprisoned by our selfing. We can be imprisoned by a lot of the self-talk that we do. We can be imprisoned by how things used to be, imprisoned by very restrictive and inflexible self-stories, imprisoned by our pursuit of individuality, imprisoned by the self, the relentless pursuit of self-esteem, self-actualization, and self-improvement. We can be imprisoned by living our lives as though they were a self-improvement project. Our lives are not a self-improvement project. The very fixated story about ourselves, about me, is often comprised of a narrative or a tale of what's wrong, what's not right. A script that essentially has me playing the role of a victim. We are particularly caught or fixated when we find ourselves in that kind of handball alley of I'm useless, I get everything wrong, versus no one really appreciates me. So there can be a very fast kind of game in our heads between the kind of I'm awful, I'm useless, and poor me. Does that make a little bit of sense? And we can get caught in that kind of story in our heads, in that treadmill. One of the major problems of living in this kind of bubble of a very fixated, subjective sense of ourselves is that we get caught in that kind of handball game of inflation, self-inflation, and self-denigration. The inflation of ourselves and the denigration of ourselves seems to be what the ego thrives on. The ego that we have, right, isn't particularly fussy, as long as it's getting something, right? So as long as it's hearing something about itself, so you're useless, you're wonderful, right? As long as, if we're inflating ourselves or denigrating ourselves, ego is happy. So once it's getting that kind of attention, it's happy. It doesn't matter what it's getting. It's all equally self-obsessed. There's a friend of mine who describes sometimes the interaction with people. Have you ever seen that? Probably people in your own family, if they're anything like mine, and who don't really like each other, but they spend an awful lot of time together. And it's all very kind of explosive and reactionary, and all very. Do you know that one? It's all very EastEnders. It's like constant EastEnders. I've heard somebody describe it as an experience of negative intimacy, right? It's a way of being close, right? It's negative. It's not very pleasant, but there's a closeness in it. Does that make sense? So the kind of ego is a little bit the same, right? It kind of likes its own negative intimacy. It likes the attention it gets, even if it's good or bad. If it's inflatory, or if it's a denigration. There's a story told about a child talking with his grandfather, and his grandfather is a Native American, and this was just after 9/11 in 2001. Yeah, in 2001. And the young child is asking his granddad, he's asking, Granddad, why did this happen? Why did people do this? Why did people do this? And the elderly man explained to his grandson, he explained that it's like having two wolves who were fighting in his heart. And one wolf was vengeful, critical, and angry. And the other wolf was understanding and kind. And the little boy maybe was a bit confused about this. And he asked his granddad, he said, well, Granddad, he said, which wolf will win the fight? And the old man was silent. He kind of looked out the window for a minute or two. And then he smiled at the young boy. And he said, the one that wins will be the one that I choose to feed. So we too, my friends, have a choice. We have a choice about which wolf we feed. Which wolf will I choose to feed? But it's really important to say that it isn't something that we just decide to do. It's not as simple as deciding which wolf I'm going to feed. So we can't just decide, oh, I'm not going to be self-critical anymore, right? We don't have a switch. It's not a switch, right? And the difficulty is, if we adopt that kind of approach, that in itself then becomes another reason to beat ourselves up. Look at me, I can't even be kind to myself. So we've got to be careful about how we do that. So yes, we have some choice and responsibility to feed the wolf that's kind and understanding. But that's not going to happen very quickly, that change. And anyone who tells you that it is selling you a pup. Because what we're talking about there is changing the relationship that we have with ourselves. And that is not going to happen very quickly, I'm sorry to say. I wish it'd be great if there was a drug, or if there was a switch, or if there was a procedure, or a part of the brain that could be used. We've tried all those things. They don't really work. So we have sometimes not a lot of choice about this apparatus, this brain in our heads. But we do have a lot of choice about which wolf we continue to feed. But that's a slow process. And over the years in teaching mindfulness in the hospital, I began to think, there's something that happens for people when they, during the course of a mindfulness training, or during good therapy, not that happened with me very often, but there's something that happened there. And to me, 10 or 12 years ago, I began to think there's what seems to happen, and you couldn't really say this at the time because it wasn't really cool to talk about people being kind to themselves, and it certainly wasn't cool to talk about compassion. But what struck me as a younger psychologist was that what seemed to happen was that people became kinder to themselves. They became a little more accepting of themselves. That sounds very unpsychological, doesn't it? You wouldn't be able to write or publish a paper on that then. But what my clinical observation and the observation, not an observation, my own lived experience as a human being was the changing relationship that I saw with patients and the changing relationship that I saw or managed to change with myself over the years. Because there was a time, and still can be, but there certainly was a time when the relationship I had with myself was pretty hellish, and it wasn't a nice place to be. And as I said, anyone who says that that's going to change very quickly is telling you lies. But the good news is that it does change. It's incremental, but it's not change that's washed away with the next crisis that we hit in our lives. Does that make a little bit of sense? It doesn't. It's not going to be washed away. So that capacity to develop a kinder relationship with ourselves stays with us for life, through thick and thin, through adversity. So it's not as simple as making a choice. We've got to practice. We've got to practice and we've got to build skills. Like changing any relationship we have in our lives, it's not easy. We have very well-worn grooves in our brains. We have very well-worn pathways in our brains that can almost dictate how we are. It can feel like a knee-jerk reaction sometimes. It can feel very automatic, as though we're hijacked by the self-critic, the all-too-familiar self-critic. We need to learn ways to be kind and to understand, to be the kind and understanding wolf. And it's like learning anything new. It's going to take time and lots of repetition. Anyone who offers a quick and easy solution to a new you is selling you a pup. There is no quick way to change the relationship that we have with ourselves, but it is worth it. It's quite simple, we're going to get much better at what we repeat. So we know this from basic laws of behavioral science. Repetition brings expertise, right? Whatever that is. So if we repeat criticism, if we repeat something, we'll become pretty expert at it. So we've got to choose what we're repeating in our lives. Unfortunately, life is going to present us with lots of opportunities to relearn, to repeat, and to repeat. That's the good news. There's a poem that people may have heard already by Petura Nelson. It's called Walking Down a Different Street. I walk down the street and there's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I am lost. I am helpless. It isn't my fault. It takes forever to find a way out. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. I fall in again. I can't believe I'm in the same place again. But it isn't my fault. It still takes me ages to get out. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see that it is there, but I still fall in. It's a habit. My eyes are open. I know where I am. It is my fault. I get out immediately. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. I walk down a different street. So we can learn to walk down a different street. We can learn to relate to ourselves differently. We can learn to be kinder, to notice our self-talk. The scientists and psychologists describe this as metacognition, where we begin to notice what we're thinking, right? Begin to notice our thinking. And this is one way that mindfulness really helps, because it helps us to tune in to what's going on as part of that iceberg that we went back to. It helps us to tune in to the self-talk. You know, the I am, she is, we are, all that. It helps us to tune into that, a lot of which is unconscious. And we can interrupt and notice the downward spiral, the anxiety girl who jumps to the worst conclusion in a single bound, or the Charlie who thinks, how am I going to cope? So it can help us to interrupt the loop of anxiety upwards, or the downward spiral of depression, when we begin to notice what's going on in these minds of ours. But the really interesting thing to say, for me, from the literature, and to say tonight, is that noticing and that mindfulness works best, and the literature tells us this, scientific, lots of studies, lots of people involved, that noticing works best when it's kind and tender and soft and compassionate. Because if we develop a noticing that's the opposite, what happens? We get more depressed and we get more anxious. So the important thing is that it's not just about noticing our thoughts, but it's noticing those thoughts and those patterns with a tone of tenderness and gentleness and kindness. Compassion is not just about creating nice feelings for ourselves. It's not just about nice feelings for ourselves and for other people. Compassion is, the translation of the word means to suffer with. That we suffer with, we turn up to our own experience and then we suffer with. And it has all of the emotional, cognitive and behavioural elements involved and necessary to do that. We might think that Paul Gilbert, a psychologist working in the UK, says that compassion is a deep awareness of our suffering. Really importantly, so be aware of it, but it's also coupled with a desire and effort to relieve it. So we do something. We walk down a different street. The compassion is the acknowledgement that not all of our pain can be fixed, but that our suffering is made more approachable in the landscape of suffering. This is not compassion, by the way. People often come to the mindfulness and compassion groups in the hospital, and they have two fears. They say, if I become compassionate, if I become more self-compassionate, I lose the run of myself, right? I'll eat and drink and do what I want, right? Number one, yeah. I lose the, what do they say? Yeah, I lose the run of myself, or I won't do anything. I won't turn up anymore. I won't make a big effort, or I'll become a doormat, right? So if I become compassionate, people will welcome me. And that is absolutely not true, because compassion absolutely means saying no and laying down very clear boundaries in our lives. In fact, compassion is not for the faint-hearted. This is indulgence and not self-compassion. So, in case you're wondering, we, for a civilization utterly fixed on happiness, we're not doing a very good job, are we? The wealthiest country in the world, North America, the highest consumers of antidepressants and anxiolytic medication in the world. We're not doing a very good job at getting happier. And my contention is that a big part of that is the focus, is the treadmill of selfing. Let's experiment and maybe see what that's like for you over the next little while. I'm going to stop talking now and say that one of the real contradictions in some of this work is the easiest way, the most sustainable way to ease our emotional and psychological suffering and pain is to experience it fully. That sounds a bit odd, doesn't it? Why would you want to do that? You're turning towards it and it's already there. And we can spend our lives running from our emotions. But no matter how fast we run, we can never escape them. And the idea that our pain, our emotional, mental suffering is actually inflated or exaggerated usually by our resistance. We push it away, push it away, push it away, push it away, push it away. So it's here. It's already here. And that comes back to the allowing. It's here. And then I take wise action. Okay? So we're not a lapdog, we're not a floor mat, but then I take wise action, wise, compassionate action. I'm going to finish. I was in the gym the other morning. I'm going to stop now. I was in the gym the other morning, and there was a fitness instructor talking to a group of people, and she said, oh, okay, guys, okay, make 2015 the most competitive year you've ever had with yourself. And I thought, wow, Wow. Isn't that fascinating now, that we're encouraging ourselves to be competitive with ourselves in order to become something we're not? So my invitation tonight is to make 2015 the kindest year that you've ever been to yourself. The kindest year. So thanks very much.
How would mindfulness help someone with severe depression?
How will mindfulness help someone with severe depression? That's a really good question. And I'm always really very cautious about recommending mindfulness to anyone. What we know about mindfulness from the research is that mindfulness works very well for people who are in remission from depression. So there is a question mark around an 8-week mindfulness program for people who are in crisis, right? Or who are very low. So for example, when I work with patients with cancer, and we've had nearly 400 patients through mindfulness training in Vincent's, cancer patients. But those patients come after they've had chemotherapy and when they're well. So there is, the problem is that mindfulness is now being proposed as the answer for every ill. And it is not. It is not. And in fact, there's some suggestion in the literature, in the research, that says there may even be times when it's to be avoided. That sometimes if my internal world is a very harsh place, that it may not be the place for me to go. That maybe the most important thing I can do is look after my exercise and my sleep and my diet. So I constantly say to people in situations, and I run the Masters in UCD in Mindfulness, and I've been at it for years, but we cannot oversell it. We've got to be very, very careful about overselling it, because the science, if you like, or the research is kind of only catching up with it. And the problem is that if we oversell it, and people go and it doesn't go very well because there's a big crisis going on, it can kind of be off their list then and think, well, that didn't work either. So we can set ourselves up for a fall. Does that make sense? Yes. Yeah. So caution. I'd always be a little bit cautious.
Yeah. Thank you.
Paul, I'd like to sincerely thank you for an absolutely wonderful presentation. It's a huge privilege for us to have someone of your experience here. And I'm really struck particularly by your answer to the question on mindfulness and how you're saying that you wouldn't recommend it for everybody, you recommend caution. And that's a really, really key point for us in Aware, because we've been put under, I wouldn't say pressure, but lots of people keep asking, why is Aware not providing courses on mindfulness? And as you know, and you've very generously given so much of your time already to work with us and with other colleagues in looking at this question. And Aware is in the process of looking at researching mindfulness and the impact of mindfulness. And we're following your advice and slowing down. And I think, again, what you've said is just really great. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Claire. Really happy to. Yeah.
This isn't a question, but I'm talking from my own experience. I suffered with a very acute bout of anxiety and depression 3 years ago, and I was an inpatient, and I couldn't have bear the thought of anybody saying do practice of mindfulness. But I've now come around through my recovery. I'm quite involved in Mindfulness Ireland, and I go to what we call sanghas and groups where we practice.
Yeah.
And for me, it has. I was a worrier.
Yeah.
I was projecting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Family stuff,
Yeah.
and I was all the time helping other people.
Yeah.
And it's almost as it has. I've stopped all that tape playing in my head.
Yeah.
And I sort of go back to the breath and back to the moment if I do feel any anxiety or worry coming on. And I realise I'm not in control. But I certainly, if anyone had talked about it when I was really down in the dumps here,
Yeah.
I would have run a mile. I wouldn't have wanted to know about it.
I'm really glad that you've said that.
Yeah. I couldn't even bear sometimes when they would take us to the room and listen to that quiet music, you know.
Yeah.
I couldn't even breathe through it. And I normally, I would be a yoga follower, and I love yoga movement and yoga breath, and but none of that would come to me when I was in that horrible.
Your experience,
place.
your experience of the acute, if that's the right word, the acute episode of mental health or psychological difficulty, and that mindfulness, probably not the best thing for us at that point. But the really important thing that you've said there and to underline is, what we know is that mindfulness is hugely helpful when we are in, I hate the word remission, I think, but when we're reasonably well, right?
Yeah.
That it keeps us there, right?
Yeah.
That it's a kind of a wellness intervention. So when we find ourselves in a place that's like, actually guys, the dust has settled a little bit, think I'm doing okay, well then, right, then we can begin to lean in to our experience as human beings. A little bit like what the lady said earlier on, that when we're in an acute state of distress, sometimes avoidance is the best thing we can do.
Oh, absolutely.
So,
I couldn't even have my family with me. I felt so.
Yeah, really important.
Yeah. Thank you.